Welcome back to Echo Ridge and another episode here in our Max Colonization series, where today we're going to be turning all this juicy oil into some sweet, sweet petroleum. And we're going to do so with this. Except I haven't built it yet. I just put that image in there as sort of a teaser. Who knows what sort of chaos is going to happen between now and then. First, as the normal, let's go through a couple of colony updates. The changes we made in regards to the sleep schedules for the sleepy dupes has worked out well. We're up to over 14 dream journals, and with all the oxygen restored to the somnium synthesizer, we're no longer having a problem getting that maximum aptitude bonus. In slightly not as good news, we have managed to end up with a couple of small blobs of oxygen inside of our chlorine ranches, and I figured out why. Unfortunately, despite the fact that I have the overflow with the high pressure gas vent, my only conclusion is that somehow in the past maybe 50 or 60 cycles, we've still gotten little blobs that end up bypassing this input. And I just paused it to show you why. Notice that there's already 1 kilo worth of oxygen in here, and you'll notice right there, that little tiny blob. And it's because the amount of oxygen that was coming out from the gas pump was too big to join with a pre-existing blob that was already in the loop before it had a chance to rack and stack and go where it needed to go. Once again, this is just me underscoring the fact that yes, please just use a mechanical filter. So I am going to do what I should have done a long time ago and just get rid of all of this and just replace it. Now the system is guaranteed to not fail, which is exactly the way I like to play this game. In the interim, I have put in our filter system back. There's not a lot of oxygen in here. You can see we've already collected most of it, but I'll let this run for just a little bit longer and that will be that. The only other place that we are running a powerless filter is inside the rockets. And it still makes sense in here because, well, I don't care if there's carbon dioxide in here because it'll eventually get siphoned out going to the vacuum of space. Not to mention it is much less likely for that to happen using the mini gas pump because it only siphons at a rate of 50 grams per second. So the possibility of too much getting stacked and overflowing is really, really small. Over on Recallan, it is business as usual, although it is almost time for Callie to go home. Remember, Callie is somewhat of a super dupe with very high skills in machinery, athletics, construction, and excavation, so they'll be needed on future space missions when we colonize other planetoids. But before that happens, I think it'll be smart to strip mine a lot of this. I also wanted to show you that we found a forest core on this planetoid. As we can see here on the star map, it says lush core. So we do have access to pips and trees, which at the minimum gives us a lot more options. Getting down there is going to be a pain in the tuchus because, well, there's sporkids everywhere. At least these two cavities have the sporkids sort of wilted. But as soon as we open it up, all that carbon dioxide is going to rush in there. So we'll have to be a little bit careful when we drill down into the lush core. But for now, I'm just going to be working in the background, sort of digging things out whenever I can. Lastly, I wanted to show you a potential problem that we have over here on our home planetoid of Fernial. And that's the fact that there's 936 kilos of hydrogen in every single tile here in our bee sanctuary. It doesn't seem to be affecting our beta hive. As you can see, there's still bee tinies running around. Not to mention, the bee tinies, nor the Saturn critter traps, have a maximum atmosphere pressure. So right now it's not an issue, but oh boy could it be in the future. Especially if you give it another 1,000 cycles. But it comes down to the fact we're just not using enough power. You can see that our first run of hydrogen generators in the last 5 cycles has only ran 2% of the time. The second set, 0%. And it's because we're generating so much power from these steam turbines, and it's doing that because, well, there's a lot of heat in here. The batteries are only set on 9050, which is below the 9060 for this set of hydrogen generators and below the 9055 of the second set of generators. And since our natural gas generators are set at 9050 as well, I think I'm going to reduce the steam turbines down to 9040 so the natural gas generators run first. But as you can see from this thermosensor, which is registering beyond 190 degrees, remember we had to raise it a little bit because we had peat turning into coal at 226 degrees once it flashes up. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to use all that extra power on. Maybe I should add more transit tube access points, or maybe even extending the duplicant's downtime so more people use the arcade cabinet. The poor arcade cabinet's only been used 5% of the time in the last 5 cycles. The jukebox, 4%. I mean, right now they're already on 3 downtime slots. Alright, I guess we're going with 4, which is going to match the sleepy schedules that are also set on 4. Recalin, they still have a lot of work to do, so they only get 2 downtime slots. The point of all that, though, being that the more downtime the dupes have, the more opportunities they have to use the arcade cabinet and the jukebox, which are very expensive when it comes to power. Now on to the subject of the petroleum boiler. I have chosen this area here because I think this will be enough room, and it's conveniently located a lot closer to our sauna and where our rockets are. We also have convenient access to power, so I think this area works out well. I think I'm going to move these ladders over a little bit. Don't know if we'll need to get up here, but just in case, I'd rather make the room. I'm also going to move this power line over, and that way we have plenty of room for activities. Let's start off by doing a brief education on why we use petroleum boilers in the first place. The game gives us a building called an oil refinery that takes 10 kilos worth of crude oil and turns it into 5 kilos worth of petroleum. It requires 480 watts, but you also get a little bit of natural gas out on the other side as well. This is also a duplicant process. In other words, the duplicant actually gets an errand to come use the oil refinery. So for the cost of 480 watts, some dupe labor, we're getting 50% of the petroleum from our crude oil. But there's another way that a lot of people end up using, and that is by boiling the crude oil. Because when we do end up boiling it, we get 100% of the petroleum back out on the other side. For ye old standard petroleum boiler, when you're using something like a volcano as a heat source, you're able to get 100% of the petroleum for little to no power and without requiring duplicant effort. Now, because this area is longer than it is taller, I'll probably be erring on the side of a long petroleum boiler. Now, you may be wondering, well, Echo, there's no heat source over here. Well, that's because I'm going to be trying something I haven't seen before. Because we have access to iridium on this planetoid, I can make an iridium thermo-aquatuner, which will give me a plus 500 degree to overheat temperature. Why is that important? Well, because we've seen petroleum boilers that use thermium, which as a material has a plus 900 to overheat temperature, and used it as a heat source. Unfortunately, thermium generates the heat, all of that heat turns the oil to petroleum, and whammo blammo, you've turned crude oil into petroleum. Well, we're going to be doing the same thing, but with the iridium, but because the material has the lower overheat temperature threshold, it's going to be much tighter margins, which is where I think some of the chaos is going to come from. But as an example, I will just put down an iridium thermo-aquatuner. This is not where this is going to go, but I at least want to show you so we know what we're working with. As a reminder, our target temperature is 399.9 to go from crude oil to petroleum. Plus, we're going to be wanting to give it about 5 more degrees. Remember, in oxygen not included, nothing is going to change states at this specifically prescribed temperature. It's normally about 2 degrees plus and minus, and they do this to make sure that materials don't sort of flash back and forth constantly. The issue that we're going to run into, though, is remember the thermo-aquatuner needs to have coolant going through it. So whenever we call the thermo-aquatuner for more heat, we have to make sure that that coolant can get even colder. There are some tricks that we can do, but once again, the margin's going to be pretty tight. Our sample thermo-aquatuner is complete, and as you can see, we have a very nice thermoconductivity of 170 and the overheat temperature of 625, which hopefully we stay very far away from, because remember, if we get the petroleum above 538, well, we'll then have sour gas, and we don't want sour gas. Sour gas is bad. Well, I say all that knowing that the viewers watching this video really want to see some sour gas. Now that I'm looking at it more, while this area is more conveniently located to the rockets, it's not as conveniently located to the source of oil, which is right here. Additionally, I have this giant area right here that I could use. Now, I plan on making this particularly small, so I don't think I have to use this space. It just seems like this space is a little lonely and really want something else to go here. And I don't know what else would go here, so I think this is our spot. Granted, I'm going to have to get 2 power wires down there. And that doesn't seem to be the easiest of all tasks. More power transformers, please. This first one, we can run this line here, recapturing all of this. Actually, no, not there, because these two can be our primary. Why aren't we scooched all the way over? We need to scooch. Now that I'm saying that, let me know in the comments below if you or your region use the word scooch, especially in the context that I'm using it in, because Google tells me it means to crouch or to squat. But whenever I say scooch, I mean scooching this over, to the left. I'm even moving my head right now, even though you can't see it. Oh dear goodness, what did I just kill power to? Anything that's going to be disastrous? Not to worry, more power's coming. I'm also going to create a couple more here. Oh, I just realized why that power transformers were offset. It's probably because it would fit perfectly down here like this. That's why it was offset by 2. But we're never going to need that many transformers, right? I'm starting off by adding the transformers here so they can take care of all the business here in the middle. Well, not middle, but at least not at the very far edge where it's getting a little too tight. After a little bit of recombobulating, we have everything back online, and I have 2 available power lines that go straight down here. And yes, we are going to need both of them. More on that here in a minute. And I've sort of started the shell. This is going to be the heat chamber. This is going to be the boiling plate. Our iridium Aquatuner is going to be sitting right here. And then I'm going to use a thermal sensor right on top of it. That's going to check and see whether or not this room is hot enough. If it's not hot enough, we're going to turn the thermal Aquatuner on. Now I am going to have to fill this with a liquid, so I'm not exactly sure the order in which everything's going to go in. But I do know that this room is fine with being this size. So why don't I get everything I need in here, then I can seal it up and I can fill it from the top here. We'll need some power here. I think that will be good there. I have the piping in, at least the insulated portion that we'll need in here. And then we'll tie in the automation. And I know this automation looks a little bit different than our standard Aquatuner setup, but I promise you it will make sense in the end. I really would love some diamond temperature shift plates in here, especially on this tile right here. You know how I feel about injecting heat into the insulated tiles. I mean, worst comes to worst in the future, I can double insulate it and then none of that heat will end up getting out. Now, I did use obsidian insulated tiles because I was considering using some temperature shift plates, which, as we know, would inject a lot of heat in here. But to tell you the truth, I don't think it's 100% necessary. We're going to be filling each one of these tiles up with about 50 kilos worth of steam, which is going to provide plenty of thermals for the metal tiles here, which I have made out of nickel, just because I don't have a lot of great... Ooh, I do have 200 kilos of aluminum, but I don't have any more aluminum ore, so if I can't make the whole thermal path out of aluminum, there's no sense in making one of them out of aluminum. What's the thermal conductivity on iridium? It is substantially higher than the nickel, but notice that specific heat capacity is much lower. So I think we'll stick with the nickel here. Wait a minute. I have a whole bunch of cobalt over here. Let's load a bunch of that up, shall we? We transferred 7 tons worth of cobalt ore, so let me refine, say, 3 tons of it. And with that, we could now get a thermal conductivity of 100 and a specific heat capacity of 420 versus 91 and 440. So as I was saying earlier, I was a little worried about the thermal Aquatuner being able to displace its heat fast enough. Because remember, we have an overheat temperature of 625 degrees. So what I think I'm going to do is get rid of all the temperature shift plates, save the one in this tile here. This is the tile that's telling us that outputs the heat from the thermal Aquatuner. So as long as I have a temperature shift plate here, I can rest assured knowing that we have as much thermals being ejected into the steam as possible. Yes, the diamond temperature shift plate would do a little bit better about transferring that heat all the way up to the first heat plate, but I am not too worried about it. And in the end, I will end up putting some drywall here, but remember, drywall doesn't inject thermals into the insulated tiles. Not that I think it's going to be too big of a deal, but still something I wanted to keep an eye on. Now when I'm loading up this chamber, I am trying for a decent amount of steam pressure. I might even go up as high as, say, 100 kilos. In that way, it can hold so much more heat than if I only put a little bit of steam in here. We're going to start off with 1 layer of brine because it's heavier than something like salt water. Then I'll put a little bit of salt water in here. and then I'll finish it off with some water. The idea being that we'll have 3 layers, and I don't have to actually fill this up with 6 tons worth of water. I, of course, dropped off a smidge more than what my target was, but that's not a big deal. More steam is better, because once again, it's acting as sort of a heat battery, which means I can seal this up. Next up, we're going to need a door to control how much heat we're injecting into our petroleum tank. I'll also need some automation here. It will end up going right up to a thermosensor that's going to sit right about there. Now we have an ability to control how much heat that's going in. I can put our actual boiler plates in. I think we're ready to start building the tank itself. I think 4 tiles will be high enough, although this is always a little bit of guesswork. I'll also need the vent where we're going to actually be dropping the crude oil from. I think that's high enough. And that way we can go over. And then from here I can start building the counterflow heat exchanger, which for those of you seeing this for the very first time might be a little confused. Let me build this first, and then I'll go into an explanation of why we use a counterflow heat exchanger, because it makes a lot more sense when you can visualize it. And here we go. As you'll soon see, this is where all of our crude oil is going to be turning into petroleum. As it does, a little bit it's going to overflow and run itself down here, flow this way, drop down, flow this way, until we finally have it down here in this area where this pump's going to take the petroleum wherever we need it. To start off with, to some petroleum rockets. But this petroleum is going to be over 400 degrees. That's not petroleum that you really want to work with. Using it as rocket fuel is not the only thing that we need it for. We'll eventually need it in the emulsifier to turn fullerene into supercoolant. We'll also need it to combine with isosap to make viscogel. So what can we do to make that petroleum a little bit cooler? Well, we can cool it down with our source crude oil. So what we're going to do is have that crude oil come in, and as the petroleum is falling down the counterflow heat exchanger, our crude oil is going up. I'm using cobalt here, and it looks like I have just enough. The other side effect of using the counterflow heat exchanger in this method is because we're heating the crude oil up, by the time it gets to this point, it should be around 399 degrees, so that way when it drops down and hits this boiler plate that's sitting at around 405, it instantly flashes into petroleum. At least, once again, that's the plan. We still have a lot more to work to do, but the rest of this will be much easier to do inside of a vacuum. So I'm going to fill this liquid lock and then pump all of the gas out. Now this will take a second because of how blocked off this area is. I could have probably started with the shell and then vacuumed it out before building everything out. But I like starting from this position here and then sort of building everything around it. While I'm waiting for that to vacuum out, it seems like we've got a potential dupe here in the printing pod. While I like Bonnie and I am looking for a rancher to eventually take Callie's place over on Recallan, I'd rather them have the interest in ranching or farming and ranching together. But in this case, it looks like we have a general all-around dupe in Devon. I don't care much about the chilly surroundings, but they do have the increased strength, a negative that we don't care about, and they have an interest in tidying. So I think Devon is going to be a great pick things up and set them down dupe. So welcome to our 26th dupe of the series. Thisp. Sorry, Thisp, you will be spending all of your foreseeable future inside of the gym. The vacuum and the wallpaper is complete. Look, I'm not an artist. This is the best I could do. The whole idea is this being like a danger zone because it's so hot. And then the little red marks are where the petroleum's actually flowing and sitting. Let me know in the comments below how you would have decorated it a little bit different. But we're all done vacuuming this out, which is important for the primary reason being, remember, we're going to have liquids flowing down the counterflow heat exchanger. You don't want an atmosphere in here that is interacting with the liquids. Otherwise, it would potentially be the same temperature here as it would be down here. So you wouldn't get the efficiency in your boiling chamber, nor would you get cool petroleum out at the other end. Now that I'm looking at it, it really does look like a candy cane factory or something. Please give me your suggestions. With that part complete though, we can start looking at this area here, which is a little bit different than you've seen in a lot of petroleum boilers. This is important because we're using the thermal Aquatuner to generate heat. Remember, you have to have a coolant in here for the thermal Aquatuner to chill in order for it to turn on and generate heat. Well, we don't have any coolant like supercoolant. That is very difficult to freeze, so we need to make sure that coolant doesn't freeze in the pipes. In other words, a target for the thermal aquatuner to keep chill. But at a certain point, we wouldn't be able to put any more chill in this area either, so we need something to be able to heat this place up as the thermal aquatuner is chilling it down. Insert our fun liquid tepidizer, which is one of the very few buildings in the game that is more powerful than the thermal aquatuner. Notice that it can generate over 4,000 kilodtus per second. Our thermal aquatuner generates less than a quarter of that. So as the thermal aquatuner is boiling this area and keeping it nice and hot, it'll be chilling this area, and the liquid tepidizer is going to be used to make sure that the thermal aquatuner is not successful in freezing this area. We are once again using a thermal sensor to control the automation on the liquid tepidizer to let it know when to turn on and off. I have this power wire. I suppose I can separate all of this right there. So we have one circuit running the thermal aquatuner in the door, and then another one running the liquid tepidizer, the liquid pump, and a liquid shutoff. More on this in a little bit. Now I also need to put in the radiant liquid pipes from the thermal aquatuner, where it's going to be dumping its chill. And I probably want to use cobalt here as well. So I will queue up. Well, I'm never really going to use cobalt ore, am I? Although I don't like using all of something. So we'll just go with another 29 batches, leaving us a ton of the ore for, just in cases. And remember, with a liquid tepidizer, it has to be fully submerged. Not to mention that we want as much thermal mass here for the thermal aquatuner to dump its chill into. So we're going to be filling this place chock full with some beautiful water. Just as soon as we have the cobalt, we're almost there. I think we can just do one of these numbers. Yes, this will work out well. And then I can come back in through there. I suppose I also need to fill that loop. Now, I wish I had something more convenient, like supercoolant. That would make this much more risk adverse. Unfortunately, we don't. But I want this loop to be as efficient as possible with dumping its chill and picking up heat. So we're going to use the best coolant we have available, and that is polluted water. With the risk, of course, being that it freezes at -20. Now, we did say the liquid tepidizer is stronger than the thermal aquatuner, but that doesn't mean that the polluted water is going to be able to pick up enough heat. So I'm going to put in a precaution trigger that may not be necessary, but I think it'll work out well. And that's by using a liquid pipe thermosensor combined with an AND gate. So now both of these sensors will have to be pushing out a green signal in order for the thermal aquatuner to be able to turn on. And I will set the liquid pipe thermosensor to say, hey, as long as the polluted water is above, let's say 5 degrees, you are good to continue doing your job so long as the thermosensor is also ringing true. At the end of this build, we may learn that this was not necessary at all. Once again, it is just a precaution. Oh boy, I about made a mistake here. I can't bring a bottle of polluted water into this vacuumed out area. I'm going to have to do something weird like this. We'll fill the coolant loop from the outside, and that way the polluted water doesn't come in here and start off-gassing. I can also start filling this chamber up with water, where we have the liquid tepidizer set on below 30. In other words, if the water is below 30 degrees, the liquid tepidizer will turn on. This is not going to take too much because this loop is so small, so I'm going to wait till it gets down to one more, and then I will cut it off here. I really would rather one more blob in there. Let's slow the game down just a smidge, and that will do it. I've got a little bit of waiting to go while we fill this room up with more water. We're going to put as much as I can in here. That way, as I said, there's as much thermal mass as possible. Notice that the liquid pipe thermosensor is saying, hey, the coolant is safe because it is above 5 degrees. And since I have this door open, there's going to be no heat transfer from here to here. So I can actually start heating this up. So I'm going to turn on the thermal aquatuner by telling the thermosensor, hey, send a green signal if it's below, let's start off with 500 degrees. And we can see the water quickly warming up. It's already at 47 degrees. Our coolant is at 60.3. Right now, this is not a perfect example, only because our room here is not full. And once the whole thing comes up to temps, both of these machines should be running a lot less, so the coolant will have more time to stabilize. You can notice that this water here is sitting at 85 degrees, And that's because the thermosensor is not even submerged yet, so the liquid tepidizer is only turning off when it hits its target temp of 85 degrees. Because this room is a vacuum, the thermosensor is picking it up as it's minus 273, so it's like, yeah, you can run as much as you want. We have boiling steam, and it looks like we ended up with, no way, 99.8 kilos worth of steam pressure, almost right on the money. Now, if you have access to something sexy like a liquid metal, for instance, lead would be phenomenal down here. Since lead turns into a liquid at 327 degrees, this would be a perfect use case for molten lead. But we don't have any lead? Wait a minute, we do have access to lead. Over here on Recalin. How could I turn this into lead? I suppose I could drop it in there with this steam, wait for it to heat up, and then vacuum it out? No, this'll work just fine. Hopefully we see the efficiency that we're looking for. Since I've got time to burn, I'm also going to start filling this cavity up with crude oil. I'm going to make sure I don't get any crude oil up in this level, so I'm only going to fill it up to this point here. Because remember, afterwards, we want to convert the whole tank into petroleum and make sure it's hot enough. So that's going to take a little while onto itself. Plus, our oil well over here on Recalin has to produce that much oil. I already have the insulated liquid pipeline heading over to our petroleum boiler. Right now, I have the liquid shutoff being used with just a signal switch. But what I'm going to be using in the future is a hydro sensor. The hydro sensor is going to say, hey, I've got petroleum that is filling this tank. So we obviously have enough backstock. Plus, I don't want petroleum coming up on this level here because I just want the little bit that's coming down from the counterflow heat exchanger. So it will be able to control the liquid shutoff itself. Now, because a green signal overwrites a red signal, I can use either of these. There were some comments in the last video concerning the hydrogen setup about whether or not the hydrogen generator or the steam turbine would run, and they were suggesting that I used an OR gate. OR gates in most examples are pretty redundant, and the reason why is because when you have an OR gate sitting here and two inputs, what it's saying is if one or the other is green, emit a green. Well, the way Oxygen Not Included automation works, this says the same thing. If this line or this line is green, this line will be green because green overwrites red. In this specific example that the comments were talking about, it wouldn't have worked that way anyways because the OR gate would have said, hey, if the smart battery or the thermosensor is green, turn both the hydrogen generator and the steam turbine on, which is not the functionality that we wanted. And the same will go here. Once I turn this signal switch off, the hydro sensor, since there is not 500 kilos of liquid, in this case we're looking for petroleum in this tank, it's sending a green signal, will allow the crude oil to flow. But if it's ever the case that the hydro sensor is like, nope, we're good, we're full, but I'm still saying, hey, I'd like some more crude oil, I can use the signal switch as well. So in this case, I will be using the signal switch because I only want this much oil at this time. Once the whole thing's flowing, then we'll switch it over to the hydro sensor. Our steam bath is up to 300 degrees, and our coolant's sitting around 35 degrees. And that's because our thermosensor says, hey, just keep this body of water up above 30, and it doesn't take the liquid tepidizer but a fraction of a second to heat up all of that water. Every single tile of crude oil can hold about 880 kilos. We're up over 330 in our tank. We're also almost full here. We're at 200 kilos, whereas every tile of water can hold 1,000. I just turned off the signal switch here and I realized, well, I still have all this to drain, so I may have cut it a little too close. We'll see. Last few blobs. Oh, look at that. Just about perfect. I figured while we got some time, our steam room is up to 423, not shabby. I might as well start running the petroleum output. And that's, of course, going to be all insulated because this is really hot. We're going to be using igneous rock because, well, we have a forever supply of it. And I think we'll just go straight up the left side. Oh, the water line's in the way. I can move this over, no big deal. Just like that. And I'll also go over one on this side. So it's nice and even with as few corners as possible. I will have to put in a bridge over here. Just like this. because I could not use a bridge like this to jump over the water, because then the bridge would allow heat transfer from inside the sauna to outside the sauna. Our thermal aquatuner has stopped running because this tile right here is above 500 degrees. Our coolant has stabilized at exactly 30 degrees, which is precisely what we want. Now I can start heating up all of this crude oil. This is going to take a while. So we're going to say if this tile here is above 500 degrees, send a green signal, which will then open this door, stopping the transfer of thermals. Notice that the heat plate is going up in temperature. We're up to 192, 194, and the crude oil is slowly starting to rise in temperature. We are siphoning a lot of heat out of the steam room as expected. This is where something like that molten lead would be incredible. Not only would it transfer faster, but I don't know the exact density of molten lead, but let's hypothetically say it's 1,000 kilos. It's a lot better than 100 kilos worth of steam. It does look like this AND gate and liquid pipe thermal sensor were unnecessary. There's so much thermal mass in here that the thermal aquatuner is never going to be able to chill down this faster than what the liquid tepidizer can then increase the heat. The concern was whether or not this loop was long enough so that the polluted water would have time to absorb that much heat. Either way, I'm still happy we put this in there because it will still prevent other issues. For instance, if this circuit for some reason would get cut and the thermal aquatuner just kept cooling down that polluted water, well, then we'd have cracking in the pipes and a lot of big problems, because once we seal this up, we don't want to go back in. I think we'll wait for one more bucket. That should bring us up to about 960 in every single tile. Our crude oil is up to 154 degrees. So let me do some more work on recalin, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Over here, I've just been digging out this side area here, and it looks like we did discover another geyser. Ooh la la, it's a carbon dioxide geyser. I wasn't quite sure what we were going to do with that one. Of course, I am kidding. I also suppose we can start upgrading these steam engines. I will do the whole swap this module for a different module and use petroleum. One of my favorite things in ONI is when the new rocket engine is built and the scaffolding goes up. Look at the size difference between the petroleum engine and the steam engine. Granted, the petroleum engine requires a bunch of fuel tanks and oxidizer tanks. Our crude oil is getting ready to flash into petroleum. It's sitting at 402.6 degrees, and it has taken a little while, but you have to remember, in the future, we're only going to be flashing at max 10 kilos worth of crude oil per second. Oh yes, beautiful. Here comes that first petroleum now. I will let the hot stuff come all the way down. It is cooling down naturally because it has to heat all these pipes up anyways. But once we get the other two tiles converted and all of this is stabilized and this room is back up to 500 degrees, I'll turn the crude oil back on and then we'll get to see it in action. And at last, it's 100% petroleum. The room is at 420, so I'm going to give it a few more minutes. But we have started pumping some of that petroleum up towards our rockets. And you might be looking at this design and wondering, why don't I have any buffer tanks for the petroleum or for the crude oil? Well, the crude oil has its own buffer tank right here, and then the petroleum will have its own buffer tank right here. Now, as previously described, the petroleum line goes all the way up through the sauna. I don't have to worry about it flashing, unlike the water. So we come all the way up to the rockets, and this is how it will load each rocket. We did end up switching to obsidian insulated pipes up here and at the end of the sauna, just so that none of that rocket exhaust ends up heating anything up. It was also mentioned in the comments about possibly turning these tiles into steel. That way we transfer heat into the sauna when the rockets go off. Well, we already do. The rocket exhaust actually extends out 3x7, no matter what you have in its way. So a vast majority of that heat does pass through. In this case, I have an environmental background here, and you'll notice it still has oxygen coming out of it. And whenever there's other meteors and other elements sitting in this environment, we'd actually lose a lot of heat from the sauna. Not to mention the fact we're still injecting a lot of heat into the sauna, especially considering we'll be using petroleum engines and eventually hydrogen engines. There's also something I'm going to be doing up here in the space biome in several weeks, once the new test patch that Clay announced. So make sure you stay current with the series if you want to see what that's going to be. Long story short, a lot of these environments are going to be filled with carbon dioxide quite frequently. Our thermal aquatuner has stopped running, and I think I'm actually going to pump it up a little bit more to say 550 degrees. It still gives us plenty of headroom considering that its overheat temperature is at 625, but that way there's a little bit more of a buffer on heat in here when we turn the crude oil on. May not be necessary, but we're about to find out here in a minute. Another aspect of the design that you may be wondering about that you've seen differently is the fact that my petroleum boilers are always 2 tiles high in the counterflow heat exchanger. I do that just in case I need to come in here and do maintenance. The dupes can still run around freely. Also the reason why you see ladders in here. If you're really hurting on space, you can make them only 1 tile high, but it's not a big deal either way. And we're up to 550, so I think it's time to turn this on. And this time I will use the hydro sensor. So as long as it's below 500 kilos, turn on the crude oil. I'm also going to slow it down for just a minute. And notice that the crude oil instantly flashes. The door does have to shut for a minute. This heat source is definitely not as optimal as something like a volcano, considering our thermal aquatuner has to run a lot more often, but we're still getting twice as much petroleum for it. And while we're having no problem converting the crude oil, I am not in love with how long this thermal aquatuner has to run to do it. And now we're starting to lose the fight, which is not good. We have 530 kilos worth of crude oil here. I am going to turn this off and go back to the drawing board for a minute. Now, I'm not always going to be using 10 kilos per second. Remember, our source is only capable of producing 3.3 kilos per second worth of oil. Right now, we just have a bag stock. But any good petroleum boiler worth its salt can handle 10 kilos per second. And while I've loved to have filled this whole cavity with molten lead, I don't think it would have made a difference, at least in the long term, because remember, it's not a fact that we're not able to transfer the heat. The thermal aquatuner is 436 degrees. This steam is 436 degrees. It's the thermal aquatuner not being able to generate enough heat. And it might not be the medium in here, it just might be the fact that the thermal aquatuner can't produce heat that fast. Let me put a liquid valve on this and see if it can keep up with 3.3 kilos. I have the crude oil flowing at 3.3 kilos and the thermal aquatuner is keeping up. You'll notice the steam room is back up to 485 degrees, and while it goes down slightly whenever the door shuts, I'm only seeing the steam room go up in temperature, which means the thermal aquatuner can keep up with 3.3 kilos. I'm going to let this run for a little while and see what the average use for the thermal aquatuner is over the course of several cycles. While I'm doing my test, I wanted to show you some of the temperature differentials that we're coming in with. The crude oil is coming in at around 78 degrees. It starts spreading its chill, and notice that the crude oil is slowly gaining more and more temp as it's interacting with the petroleum until it hits a point of about 390. I could put a couple of more radiant liquid pipes, but I don't like to get much closer because remember, if we hit around 401, that's when the crude oil flashes. I say that because you could get even a little bit more efficient by maybe making 1 more, sometimes even 2 more radiant liquid pipes. But then it's going to be interacting with this hot petroleum, which is sitting at around 407, and then you could get some breakage in the pipes. So I'd like to play it a little bit safe. Our thermal aquatuner is having no problem keeping up, frequently getting up to 550 degrees in this tile. You can see in the last couple cycles, it's only been running 50% of the time, which is not too bad. Now, if you do have access to iridium and you're like, well, Echo, I really would like to do 10 kilos per second. What you can do is make this room bigger and just put in a second thermal aquatuner. And then you'd be generating more heat per second. I'm not sure I'm going to do that, even though I have been complaining about the fact that I'm not using enough power. And what that 50% uptime tells me is that this petroleum boiler could probably handle a little over 6 kilos per second of crude oil. Any more than that, you'll have to add a second thermal aquatuner. We're up to 1,157 kilos worth of hydrogen gas pressure. I mean, as it is, I'm already wasting water. I've started dumping everything that we're not using in our line, just so I can keep trying to get rid of these giant ponds. It's going to take a few hundred cycles, but we'll get there. I'm not in too big of a hurry. And I hope you aren't either. We still have plenty of more episodes coming in this series, and so far the views have generally been keeping up. So as long as you keep watching, I'll keep creating. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this episode in the comments below. And until next time, much love, happy gaming, I'll talk to you soon.